At the canteen, the brash vigor of cadets untested in combat filled the air. The shiny metallic walls mirrored the pale green tones of their skin, their conversations echoing as a tumult of youthful overconfidence. Cadet Valdar, broad-shouldered and sharp-tongued, reclined in his chair, his boots propped disrespectfully on the edge of the long steel table. Earth Vala, he sneered with a mischievous smirk, a globe of primitive primates wielding branches and stones. It's miraculous they've lasted long enough for our arrival. A wave of laughter followed, though it was tentative, born more of solidarity than agreement. You're not incorrect, remarked Finn, who was seated next to him, slighter in build and nervously twiddling his wristband. He looked up to Valdar like an admiring younger sibling. Their armaments were rudimentary at best. What was it called? Gunpowder, he laughed, though his tone was uncertain. Dixon, sitting opposite, stirred his ration bowl indifferently, his golden eyes flicking towards Valdar. If they were so frail, why did it take our troops years to subdue them? The room quieted, Valdar's smile wavered but swiftly returned, dismissive. Logistics, terrain, flukes, it wasn't their prowess but our oversight. Their victories were mere flukes, not feats. Before anyone could reply, a voice sliced through the chatter like a knife through cloth. Anomalies, it resonated, dripping with contempt. The cadets turned together, their confidence dissolving under the scrutiny of the figure who had spoken. Commander Kale, imposing and shadow-like against the sterile illumination, his deeply set eye clouded by an old scar, surveyed the room predatorily. Val's boots thudded to the floor. Kale advanced, his steps deliberate, his aura magnetic. His uniform displayed its own battle scars, burn marks, frayed edges, and dimmed insignia. The canteen seemed to constrict as he approached their table, the other cadets falling silent. Amusing, isn't it? Kale's voice was low and gravelly, each word laden with experience. Mocking a species you've never encountered, battles you've never fought, and sacrifices you'll never comprehend. We meant no disrespect, Commander, Finn stammered, his complexion darkening. Kale ignored him, his gaze locked on Valdar. You find Earth amusing, cadet? You think humans are a joke? Valdar straightened up, forcing himself to meet Kale's gaze. With all due respect, sir, their history speaks for itself. They barely progressed beyond combustion engines before our arrival. They're stubborn, yes, but hardly a match for us. Kale tilted his head, a humorless smile curling his lips. Hardly a match, he echoed, his voice ominously soft. Let me tell you something, cadet. The first time I set foot on Earth, I thought the same. Then I learned the cost of arrogance. The room fell deathly silent, every cadet captivated. Kale leaned forward, his scarred face looming over Valdar's. Do you know what I saw on Earth? He asked, almost conversationally. I saw children wielding improvised weapons, standing between us and their families. I saw soldiers with shattered bodies dragging themselves across battlefields to set off explosives at our feet. I saw cities refuse to surrender even as they burned. He straightened, his gaze sweeping the room, ensuring every cadet felt the weight of his words. They didn't fight because they thought they could win, Kale continued. They fought because surrender was a fate worse than death. They fought for each other, for their survival, for the vision of what they could become. And do you know what that makes them? No one responded, even Valdar remained silent, his usual bravado crumbling under the intensity of Kale's stare. That makes them dangerous, Kale whispered, his voice echoing louder than any shout. Dangerous in a way you can't understand until you've stood on the other side of their defiance, until you've seen how far they're willing to go to protect what's theirs. Dixon, ever the skeptic, dared to speak. With respect, sir, isn't this just embellishment? Stories grow in the telling. Kale's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unwavering. Embellishment? Do you think this, he tapped his clouded eye, was a gift? That the scars on my body and the ghosts in my mind are fabrications? Dixon looked away, chastened. Cale stepped back, his presence somehow enlarging. You think I'm exaggerating? Fine. Sit there in your ignorance, laugh at them, mock them. But before you do, listen to what I have to say. Hear what I saw, what I survived, and then tell me if you still believe they're worth mocking. He turned to leave but paused at the threshold. Without looking back, he added, tonight, you'll learn what it means to face true resilience. Be ready. You'll need more than arrogance to endure it. The door slid shut behind him, leaving the mess hall in stunned silence. Vala shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly shaken. Finn stared at the table, his fingers nervously tracing patterns on its surface. Dixon, ever analytical, seemed deep in thought, his earlier skepticism eroded by the weight of Cale's words. For the first time, the cadets weren't laughing. The room was dimly lit, its cold, metallic walls swallowing the faint hum of the ship's engines. The cadets sat stiffly, their earlier bravado replaced with an uneasy silence. Commander Cale stood at the center, his imposing figure framed by the faint glow of the holographic display behind him. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken gravity. Cale's scarred face, a map of battles fought and lost, bore no trace of humor. When we landed on Earth, Cale began, his voice a measured growl, we thought we'd already won. Our fleet darkened their skies, their cities burned beneath our weapons. We were superior in every way, stronger, faster, better armed. Yet, for all our might, we underestimated one thing. He paused, allowing the silence to settle. Their will. The cadets exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of his words sinking in. Our first engagement was in a place they called Ravencroft, Cale continued, pacing slowly. A sprawling human settlement nestled against a vast mountain range. It should have been an easy victory, a textbook invasion. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught off guard. Or so we thought. Cale's voice darkened, his eyes distant as if reliving the memory. We breached their defenses within hours, forcing them into retreat. But instead of scattering, they regrouped. They dug in, using every inch of the terrain to their advantage. We chased them into the mountains, expecting to crush them. What we found instead was hell. He stopped pacing, his gaze piercing. I remember the first time I saw their leader, Captain James Carter. He wasn't imposing by our standards, short, lean, with a face lined by years of hardship. But there was something in his eyes, something unyielding. He stood at the front lines, rallying his troops with a calm defiance that bordered on madness. They followed him not out of fear, but because he made them believe they could win. And in that belief, they found strength. The cadets were silent, their earlier skepticism replaced with rapt attention. Even Valdar, who had led the mockery, leaned forward slightly, his jaw clenched. Cale's voice softened, but the tension in his words remained. We thought we could break them with superior firepower, so we bombarded their positions relentlessly. The mountains echoed with the sound of our cannons, the ground scorched black by our weapons. And yet, every time we advanced, they were there, waiting, fighting, refusing to yield. He turned to face the holographic display, which flickered to life, projecting a jagged mountain pass bathed in firelight. This, Cale said, pointing to the image, is where I learned what humans are capable of. The scene shifted, showing a small group of human soldiers bracing against an alien assault. Their weapons were crude by alien standards, but they wielded them with a ferocity that belied their size. In the chaos, Cale's voice grew quieter, as if speaking to himself. I saw one of their soldiers, Sergeant Nathan Drake, hold his ground against a squadron of our best. He was bleeding, his legs shattered, yet he didn't falter. He held the line, buying time for a group of civilians to escape. When he finally fell, it wasn't because he was overpowered. It was because he had given everything he had to give. Cale turned back to the cadets, his expression unreadable. I was there when Carter ordered his final counterattack. It was madness, suicide even. But he knew it wasn't about victory, it was about sending a message that Earth would never bow. They rigged the entire pass with explosives, luring our forces into a trap that cost us hundreds of lives. I barely escaped with my own. His voice hardened, the weight of guilt and respect intertwining. Carter was captured in the aftermath, wounded but alive. I was there when they brought him before our commanding officer. He could barely stand, his body broken. Yet his spirit was untouchable. Cale's gaze swept across the cadets, his voice rising. Do you know what he said, with blood on his lips and death in his eyes? He looked at us, at me, and said, "You'll never take this planet, not while a single one of us still breathes." The room was silent, the cadets frozen in place, their faces pale. Cale let the silence linger, his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. That's the kind of enemy we faced, he said finally, his tone heavy with finality. Not soldiers fighting for conquest, but people fighting for survival, for each other, for the idea of what they could be. And in that fight, they became something more than we ever expected. Cale stepped back, his expression unreadable. You think them weak? Fine. You think them primitive, laughable? But don't ever think they're incapable of defeating you. Underestimate them, and you'll find yourself learning the same lesson I did, too late. The holographic display flickered off, plunging the room into darkness. Cale's figure was barely visible, but his presence was palpable. Tomorrow, he said, his voice low but resolute, we'll continue. There's more you need to know about their weapons, their survival, and what they were willing to sacrifice to protect their home. For now, think on this: if humans are willing to destroy themselves to stop us, what else might they be capable of? With that, Cale turned and left the room, the door hissing shut behind him. The cadets sat in stunned silence, their minds racing with the images Cale had painted. Valdar stared at the empty space where Cale had stood, his fists clenched as if grappling with an invisible force. Finn broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. If they were that dangerous, how did we ever survive? No one answered. The mess hall was silent as the cadets filed in the next evening, their expressions a mix of apprehension and anticipation. Commander Cale stood waiting, his back to them as he adjusted the holographic display. The air was heavy with the weight of his previous tales, and none of the cadets dared to speak out of turn. When the last of them had taken their seats, Cale turned, his gaze sweeping the room. Yesterday, I told you about their spirit, he began, his voice calm but firm. Today, we'll talk about their weapons and the ingenuity that made them so dangerous. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a crude yet intricate schematic of a human weapon, a rifle with its long, jagged barrel and makeshift modifications rotating slowly in midair. This, Cale said, pointing to the image, is what they called a sniper rifle. Primitive in design, yes, but in the hands of the right human, it became something far greater. They didn't just use it to kill, they used it to shift the balance of entire battles. His voice grew heavier, laced with memory. I remember one such human, Lieutenant Adrian Black. He was stationed in a dense forest near one of our forward bases. For weeks, he operated alone, targeting our officers, disrupting our supply lines, and demoralizing entire units. We called him the Ghost because no matter how many troops we sent after him, no one ever saw him coming. Cale's expression hardened. I was part of the unit tasked with hunting him down. We underestimated him, as we always did with humans. He led us deep into the forest, turning the terrain against us. He knew every tree, every shadow, every sound. By the time we realized it was a trap, half my unit was gone, taken out one by a weapon so simple it shouldn't have been a threat. But it was the mind behind the weapon that mattered. The display shifted, showing an explosion ripping through a clearing. Smoke and debris filled the air as human soldiers emerged from hiding, armed with makeshift grenades and scavenged alien tech. Humans had a talent for improvisation, Kale said, his tone edged with reluctant admiration. They used whatever they could find, repurposing our own discarded technology against us. That's how they developed their EMP devices, crude, unrefined, but devastating. One well-placed blast could disable an entire platoon's worth of equipment, leaving us vulnerable and blind. Finn raised a tentative hand, his voice cautious. But Commander, if their technology was so far behind ours, how did they figure out how to use yours? Kale's gaze snapped to him, piercing and unyielding. Because necessity drives innovation, he said sharply. They had no choice but to adapt. Survival demanded it, and humans, more than any species I've encountered, are masters of survival. The holographic display shifted again, this time to a bleak urban landscape. Buildings reduced to rubble, smoke rising in thick columns, and figures darting through the chaos. They turned their cities into fortresses, Kale continued. Places like New Haven became death traps for anyone foolish enough to enter. The streets were riddled with booby traps, the rooftops bristling with snipers. They fought like cornered animals, using every advantage the terrain offered. Kale paused, his jaw tightening. And then there were the red blades. The cadets leaned forward, the name unfamiliar and forbidding. They were an elite human unit, Kale explained, named for the blood-red insignia they painted on their armor. They operated in small teams, striking under cover of darkness. Their tactics were brutal: close-quarters combat, sabotage, infiltration. They moved like shadows, and by the time you realized they were there, it was too late. Vala shifted in his seat, his voice low but defiant. If they were so formidable, why didn't they win? Kale's gaze locked onto him, cold and unyielding. Because war isn't about winning or losing, cadet. It's about surviving, and humans knew how to survive better than anyone. He stepped closer to the holographic display, his shadow looming over the cadets. I witnessed it firsthand during the siege of Ashford. We had them surrounded, outnumbered 100 to 1. They had no food, no reinforcements, no hope of escape. By all logic, they should have surrendered. But instead, they fought. They turned the ruins of their city into a labyrinth, forcing us to fight for every inch. They used traps, ambushes, even the collapsing buildings themselves to slow us down. Kale's voice grew quieter, more solemn. And then, when it became clear they couldn't hold us off forever, they made the ultimate sacrifice. They rigged the city's power core to detonate, wiping out everything within a few kilometers. Thousands of their own lives gone in an instant, just to deny us the victory. The cadets were pale, their earlier arrogance eroded by the weight of Kale's words. Even Vala seemed subdued, his usual bravado replaced with a grim silence. Kale's expression softened, but only slightly. That's what makes them dangerous, not their weapons, not their numbers, but their willingness to do whatever it takes to protect what's theirs, to sacrifice everything, even themselves, for a chance to survive. He turned off the holographic display, plunging the room into darkness once more. The cadets shifted uneasily, their minds racing with the implications of Kale's stories. You mock them because you don't understand them, Kale said, his voice low but firm. But let me make one thing clear: underestimating humanity is a mistake you won't live to make twice. He stepped toward the door, his footsteps heavy against the metal floor. Just before it slid open, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Tomorrow we'll talk about the final days of the war, he said, and what it cost both sides. With that, he was gone, leaving the cadets alone with their thoughts. The silence was deafening, each of them wrestling with the images Kale had painted. Valdar exhaled sharply, breaking the tension. If this is what they're capable of, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Dricken, who had remained quiet throughout the tale, finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "We're lucky they never reached us." No one disagreed, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Finn shifted uneasily, his earlier fidgeting now subdued. The cadets avoided each other's eyes, the bravado that had filled the mess hall only days before now a distant memory. For the first time, the alien soldiers truly understood the cost of arrogance and the terrible strength born of desperation. The training hall was silent, save for the low hum of the ship's systems. The cadets gathered around the central console, their earlier smugness now a distant memory. They had come prepared to mock and jeer, to dismiss humanity as a relic of a bygone conflict. But now, as Commander Kale entered the room, his presence seemed heavier, his gaze sharper, as if he carried the weight of countless lives. He stepped to the center of the room, the faint blue glow of the holographic display casting shadows across his scarred face. "You've heard about their bravery," he began, his voice like steel, "and their ingenuity. But now I'll tell you about the end, the final confrontation that decided the fate of Earth, and what it taught us about ourselves." The display flickered to life, revealing an image of a massive, crumbling fortress perched atop a cliff, battered by endless waves of wind and rain. "This was Unity Ridge," Kale said, "the humans' last stronghold. Their armies were broken, their cities in ruins. What remained of their population had retreated here, hoping to hold out long enough for reinforcements that would never come." He began pacing, his steps measured and deliberate. "We surrounded the fortress with our fleet, cutting off every avenue of escape. The humans had nothing left, no resources, no allies, no hope. Yet they didn't surrender. Instead, they prepared for one final stand." Kale turned to face the cadets, his voice rising. "They rigged the ridge with explosives, knowing it was their only chance. If we breached their defenses, they would bring the entire cliffside down, sacrificing themselves, and us, in the process. It was madness, but it was also brilliance." The display shifted, showing alien soldiers advancing up the steep cliffs, their movements hindered by the storm. "We launched our assault at dawn, believing it would be over within hours. But the humans fought with a ferocity I'd never seen. They knew they couldn't win, yet they refused to give an inch." Kale's voice grew softer, almost reverent. "I saw acts of courage that defied logic. A young soldier, barely out of his teens, holding a position. Alone to cover his comrades' retreat. An engineer repairing a damaged defense turret under enemy fire, knowing it would only buy a few more minutes. They fought as if their very souls were on the line." The image changed again, this time showing a human figure clad in battered armor standing atop the fortress walls. Their leader, Commander Elias Ward, stood at the forefront. He was no superhuman, just a man, tired and broken like the rest of them. But he carried the weight of their hope. He was their symbol, their anchor. And for that, he was unstoppable. Kale stopped pacing, his voice heavy with memory. Ward broadcast a message during the final hours of the siege. It wasn't a plea for help or a call for surrender. It was a declaration. He told us that even if we won, we would never conquer Earth. That their spirit would live on in the soil, in the wind, in the stars. And as long as even one human remained, we would never truly be victorious." The cadets sat frozen, the weight of Kale's words pressing down on them. He let the silence linger before continuing. "We broke through their outer defenses just as night fell. The fortress was in flames, its defenders scattered. But as we advanced, we realized too late what was happening. the display shifted to an overhead view of the fortress, its structure riddled with glowing red lines. The explosives, they'd wired everything to detonate the moment we breached the inner sanctum. Ward and his remaining soldiers stayed behind, holding the line until the last possible second. When the explosion went off, they took the entire ridge, and thousands of our soldiers, with them. Cale's voice dropped to a near whisper. I was on the ground when it happened. I saw Ward standing on the battlements, watching as the cliffs crumbled beneath him. He didn't run, he didn't try to save himself. He just stood there, resolute, as if daring the universe to break him. He turned off the display, plunging the room into darkness. That was how the war ended, not with victory or defeat, but with sacrifice. The humans lost their planet, but they left us with a lesson we would never forget. Cale stepped closer to the cadets, his gaze piercing. You think strength is about weapons, about numbers, about power. But true strength comes from something deeper, from the ability to endure, to adapt, to fight even when there's no hope of winning. The humans taught us that, and it's a lesson you do well to remember. Valdar, who had been silent throughout the tale, finally spoke, his voice trembling. What happened to them, the survivors? Cale's expression softened, a flicker of something almost like regret crossing his face. A few were taken as prisoners, others disappeared, scattering across the galaxy. But their legacy remains in every battle we fight, in every strategy we devise. We carry the memory of Earth, of what they were capable of, and of what we could become if we forget the price of arrogance. The room was silent as Cale turned to leave. At the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. You came here to laugh, to mock, to dismiss. But now you understand. Humanity was not a species to be conquered. They were a force to be reckoned with. And if you ever face their kind again, remember this, underestimating them is a mistake you won't live to repeat. With that, he was gone, leaving the cadets alone in the dim light, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Each of them grappled with the stories they had heard. Finn broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think we're like them? That we could ever be like that? No one answered, but in the silence, the cadets found their own resolve, each silently vowing to carry the lessons of humanity forward. Because in the end, it wasn't just a story about Earth. It was a story about what it meant to survive, to fight, and to be something more than the sum of their fears. And that was a story worth remembering.